Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, Chapter 3, The Blessings of Destruction. So we have finished with the broken window, an elementary fallacy. Anyone, one would think, would be able to avoid it after a few moments' thoughts. Yet the broken window fallacy, under 100 disguises, is the most persistent in the history of economics. It is more rampant now than at any time in the past, and is solemnly affirmed every day by great captains of the industry, chambers of commerce, union leaders, editorial writers, radio and television commentators, learned statisticians, using the most refined techniques, professors of economics in the most best universities. In their various ways, they all dilate upon the advantages of destruction. Though some of them would disdain to say that there are net benefits in small acts of destruction, they see almost endless benefits in the enormous acts of destruction. They tell us how much better off economically we all are in war than in peace. They see miracles of production, which it requires a war to achieve. And they see a world made prosperous by an enormous accumulated or backed up demand, pent up demand. In Europe after World War II, they joyously counted the houses, the whole cities that had been leveled to the ground that had to be replaced. In America, they counted the houses that could not be built during the war, the nylon stockings that could not be supplied, the worn out automobiles and tires, the obsolescent radios and refrigerators. They brought together formidable totals. It was merely our old friend, the broken window fallacy, in new clothing and grown fat beyond all recognition. This time it's supported by a whole bundle of related fallacies. It confused need with demand. The more war destroys, the more it impoverishes. The greater is the post-war need. So the bigger the war destroys, the more you have for a need after the war is done. Indubitably, but need is not demand. Effective economic demand requires not merely need, but our corresponding purchasing power. The needs of India today are incomparably greater than the needs of America, but its purchasing power, and therefore the new business that it can stimulate, are incomparably smaller. Again, this was written like in 1948. But if we get past this point, there's a chance for another fallacy, and this the broken windowites usually grab. They think of purchasing power merely in terms of money. Now money can be run off printing press. As this is being written, in fact, printing money is the world's biggest industry. Nothing has changed since, right? If the product is measured in terms of monetary terms. But the more money is turned out this way, the more the value of any given unit of money falls. The falling value can be measured in rising prices of commodities. But as most people are so firmly in the habit of thinking of their wealth and income in terms of money, they consider themselves better off as these monetary totals rise, in spite of the fact that in terms of things they may have less and buy less because of the decline in purchasing power, thus by inflation. Most of the good economic results which people at the time attributed to World War II were really owing to wartime inflation. They could have been and were produced just as well by an equivalent peacetime inflation. We shall come back to this money illusion later. Now, there is a half-truth to the backed-up demand fallacy, just as there was in the broken window fallacy. The broken window did make more business for the window maker. The destruction of war did make more business for the producers of certain things. The destruction of houses and cities did make more business for the building and construction industries. The inability to produce automobiles, radios, refrigerators during the war did bring about a cumulative post-war demand for those products. To most people, this seemed like an increase in total demand, as it was partly in terms of dollars of lower purchasing power. But what mainly took place was a diversion of demand to these particular products from others. The people of Europe built more houses than otherwise because they had to. They had to live someplace. But when they built more houses, they just had that much less manpower and productive capacity left over for everything else. When they bought houses, they had just that much less purchasing power for something else. Whatever business was increased in one direction, it was, except insofar as productive energies were stimulated by a sense of want and urgency, correspondingly reduced in another. The war, in short, changed the post-war direction of effort. It changed the balance of industries. It changed the structure of industry. Since World War II ended in Europe, there has been rapid and even spectacular economic growth, both in countries that were ravaged by war and those that were not. Some of the countries that in which there was the greatest destruction, such as Germany, have advanced more rapidly than others, such as France, in which there was much less destruction. In part, this was because West Germany followed sounder economic policies, in part because it was the desperate need to get back to normal housing and other living conditions stimulated increased efforts. But that does not mean property destruction is an advantage to the person whose property has been destroyed. No man burns down his own house on the theory that the need to rebuild it will stimulate his energies. After a war, there's normally a stimulation of energies for a time. At the beginning of the famous third chapter of his History of England book, Macaulay pointed out, no ordinary misfortune, no ordinary misgovernment will do so much as to make a nation wretched as the constant progress of a physical knowledge and the constant effort of man to better himself will do to make a nation prosperous. It has often been found that the profuse expenditure, heavy taxation, absurd commercial restriction, corrupt tribunals, disastrous wars, seditions, persecutions, conflagrations, inundations have not been able to destroy capital so fast as the exertions of the private citizens have been able to create it. No man would want to have his own property destroyed either in war or in peace. What is harmful or disastrous to an individual must be equally harmful or disastrous to the collection of individuals that make up the nation. Many of the most frequent fallacies in economic reasoning come from the propensity, especially marked today, to think in terms of an abstraction, the collectivity, the nation, and to forget or ignore the individuals who make it up and give it meaning. No one could think that the destruction of war was an economic advantage who began by thinking first of all the people whose property was destroyed. Those who think that the destruction of war increases total demand forget that demand and supply are merely two sides of the same coin. They are the same thing looked at from different directions. Supply creates demand because at bottom it is demand. The supply of the thing they make is all that people have, in fact, to offer in exchange for the things they want. In this sense, the farmer's supply of wheat constitutes their demand for automobiles and other goods. The supply is demand. So critical, economics. This isn't Henry here, this is me. The supply creates its own demand. Why? Because of people supplying the phone, the calculator, the book have a demand too. And they say, I have a demand for a calculator, book, an iPhone. And I'm going to supply something to you so we can trade, so we can both have our demands met. All this is inherent in the modern division of labor and exchange economy. The fundamental fact, it is true, is obscured for most people, including some reputably brilliant economists, through such complications as wage payments and the indirect form of virtually all modern exchanges are made through the medium of money. John Stuart Mill and other classical writers, though they sometimes fail to take sufficient account of the complex consequence resulting from the use of money, at least saw through the monetary veil to the underlying realities. To that extent, they were in advance of many of their present-day critics who are befuddled by money rather than instructed by it. Mere inflation, that is, the mere issuance of more money with a consequence of higher wages and prices, may look like a creation of more demand. But in terms of the actual production and exchange of real things, it is not. It should be obvious that real buying power is wiped out to the same extent as productive power is wiped out. We should not let ourselves be deceived or confused on this point by the effects of monetary inflation in raising prices or national income in monetary terms. It is sometimes said that the Germans and the Japanese had a post-war advantage over the Americans because their old plants had been destroyed completely by bombs during the war. They could replace them with the most modern plants and equipment and thus produce more efficiently and at lower cost than the Americans with their older and half obsolete plants. But if this were really a clear net advantage, Americans could easily offset it by immediately wrecking their old plants, junking all the old equipment. In fact, all manufacturers in the country could scrap all their old plants and equipment every year and erect new plants and install new equipment. The simple truth is that there is an optimum rate of replacement, a best time for replacement. It would be an advantage for a manufacturer to have his factory and equipment destroyed by bombs only if the time had arrived when, through deterioration and obsolescence, his plant and equipment had already acquired a null or negative value, and the bombs fell just when he should have called in the wrecking crew anyway. It is true that previous depreciation obsolescence, if not adequately reflected in his books, may make the destruction of his property less of a disaster on net balance than it seems. It is also true that the existence of new plants and equipment speeds up the obsolescence of older plants and equipment. If the owners of the older plant and equipment try to keep using it longer than the period for which it maximizes profit, then the manufacturers whose plants and equipment were destroyed will reap a comparative advantage, or speak more accurately, will reduce their comparative loss. We are brought, in brief, to the conclusion that it's never an advantage to have one's plants destroyed by shells or bombs unless those plants have already become valueless or acquired a negative value by depreciation. In all this discussion, moreover, we have so far omitted a central consideration. Plants and equipment cannot be replaced by an individual or a socialist government unless he or it has acquired or can acquire the savings, the capital accumulation to make the replacement. But war destroys accumulated capital. There may be, it is true, offsetting factors. Technological discoveries and advances during a war may, for example, increase individual or national productivity at the point that, and there may eventually be a net increase in overall productivity. Post-war demand will never reproduce the precise pattern of pre-war demand. But such complications should not divert us from recognizing the basic truth that the wanton destruction of anything of real value is always a net loss, a misfortune, a disaster, and whatever the offsetting considerations in particular instance can never be, on net balance, a boon or a blessing. Could not agree more. Henry, you're the man. Public works means taxes, the next chapter. So hang tight. Thanks.